Well, hello and welcome to the Huffines Institute podcast on sports medicine and human performance. I'm your host, Tim Lightfoot, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We got another great guest lined up for you today in our continuing series on the history of exercise science. It's really critically important, I think, for us to understand who brought us where we are in our field. And we're really not that far away from the beginning of exercise science. As I was talking to some of my students, that we really are only about the fifth generation of physiologists here in the United States. And whereas in other places it has much longer history, in the United States, the history is not that long or extensive. And so we're at a point where we can actually talk about and have professionals on that actually remember the founders of exercise science in the country. And today is no exception to our interesting person rule. We have a great person on with us. We have Dr. Jeff Potteiger on with us from Grand Valley State in Michigan. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Hi, Tim. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, we're really excited to have you back on the podcast. For those of you that have listened to the podcast for a while, Dr. Potteiger was on with us on episode 2001, which was in 2016. And so we're really pleased to have him back today to chat with us. I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction about Dr. Potteiger, and then we're just going to jump right into it. As I said, Dr. Potteiger is the Associate Vice President for the Graduate School at Grand Valley State University. He got his Ph.D. from Auburn, which we'll talk about in a little bit, his master's degree from McDaniel College, which is in Maryland, and his bachelor's degree from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Potteiger has got many, many accolades and honors over the years. A couple of really important ones for us, at least for this discussion, is that he is the author of ACSM's Introduction to Exercise Science book, which is now in its third edition, which has got, at the beginning of each chapter, it's actually got really nice pieces about the historical aspects of each of the things that he talks about. He's got over 100 published articles in exercise physiology. And more recently, he and I have worked together quite a bit, as he is the chair of the American College of Sports Medicine's Publications Committee, of which I've been honored to be a member for the past 6 years of that. And we were also talking before we started the podcast that in actuality, it turns out that we met each other, I think 36 years ago, when I was a doctoral student at Tennessee, and Jeff was actually interviewing at different places to do his doctoral work. And so I think we met each other then, but we didn't really know each other until much later. And so again, welcome to the podcast, Jeff. And we're going to get started about that road trip you took to find a place to do your doctoral work after coming to Tennessee. You were telling me that you went on and interviewed at Auburn, where you eventually wound up working with Dr. Dennis Wilson there.
Yeah, Tim, it's really an exciting opportunity for me to sort of reflect back on that period of my life. A little bit of history. I started out as a physical education major at Indiana University of Pennsylvania because I knew I wanted to work in the area of sports and work with athletes, and exercise physiology really wasn't all that prominent back then. The American College of Sports Medicine had only been around for 10 or 12 years, and it was something that I wanted to pursue. When I received my degree from IUP, I started out as a physical education teacher, and I did a master's degree at Western Maryland College, which changed its name to McDaniel College, and we can maybe come back and visit more about that a little bit later. But I always wanted to work at a college or a university because I felt most of the influential people in my life were my former college professors. So I decided in maybe the summer of 1984 that I was going to take a road trip, and I was going to go visit some schools down south because I wanted to live somewhere differently. I was living in Pennsylvania at the time. And I looked through the research literature and came up with 3 schools that I wanted to go see. I wanted to go see University of Tennessee, the University of Florida, and the University of Georgia. And when I got to the University of Tennessee, had a wonderful time. I met Ed Howley, and he showed me around the lab. And of course, Ed was, early on in his career as a professional, maybe had been around for 10 or 15 years. And talking to Ed, I realized that I didn't necessarily have the same interests that Ed had, I would have classified myself more as a generalist back then. And so Ed said, well, why don't you go down to Auburn and see a friend of mine, a former doctoral student of mine named Dennis Wilson? And I said, okay, that sounds good. I packed up my bags from Knoxville and took off and went down to Auburn and met with Dennis and really enjoyed my time with Dennis. He was just a great individual and we had a lot in common. We talked a lot about sports. We talked a lot about baseball. I think he even invited me to play some basketball at lunchtime when I was there in my visit. And I just had a really good feeling. And when I left there, I thought, this is where I wanted to go. But I told myself I wanted to go over to Athens and see University of Georgia. I did that. And on my drive back to Pennsylvania, I came to the conclusion that I really wanted to study with Dennis at Auburn. It was just a good fit and a good match. And, I still thank Ed Howley every time I see him at a ACSM conference for sending me to Dennis, because Dennis and I really connected. And I really felt like I came out of Auburn very well prepared to, begin my career as a faculty member at college or university.
So as Jeff and I were talking earlier, so my advisor was Dr. Ed Howley at Tennessee, and it was something that we had in common that we really haven't thought much about. But since Jeff's advisor, Dennis Wilson, actually graduated from Tennessee with Ed Howley as well, I think that makes, as we said, I'm your grand uncle in the scientific lineage scheme of things.
You are certainly related in some way. I don't know that you've ever showed up at any of my birthday parties or anything like that. We've had a couple of family reunions and you haven't shown up, but we are absolutely related in some way. And I actually find that fascinating, that people have the connections that they do, because, Dennis had that University of Tennessee connection. He was a faculty member at Auburn, and he hired actually a faculty member from LSU named Mike Stone, who was a colleague with Scott Powers at LSU. And this relationship, I think, amongst exercise science professionals is really very interesting, because people have this connection, right? And I think it really facilitates a lot of research collaboration. I think it facilitates a lot of students going from one lab to another. And I really think it enriches the experience that the students have. Our students, our master's and doctoral students, and our undergraduate students as well. But also I think it enriches ourselves professionally because of what we can talk about at conferences and the research activities that we do.
Well, it really is. It's a community of people that develop over time. And so just talk a little bit about Dennis and what he meant to you as an advisor. You've got it. Do you have any favorite stories about Dennis that you would like to share?
Yeah, I've got a great story about Dennis. We used to talk about baseball all the time. And when I went to Auburn, the Atlanta Braves were the closest baseball team to Auburn University. And he was a Braves fan and I was a Braves fan, and they weren't very good at the time. And so Dennis and I would sit in his office and we'd talk about baseball, and we'd talk about how the Braves needed to get better. And then it would sort of delve into the physiology. We would talk about how baseball players would train and what they would do to try to improve their performance. And it came around to a discussion one day about, baseball players would go for 3 or 4 or 5 mile runs to train. And we'd say, well, it doesn't make much sense, because I don't know that I've ever seen a baseball player run 3 miles during a game. It's all about short sprints, and it's all about quickness and movement. And we started to talk a little bit about how we could change the training of baseball players. And then, of course, our discussions moved into other sports. And we would talk about football. And, football players would have to do these conditioning runs. and they would be 12-minute conditioning runs, or you have to run 2 miles. And again, I never saw a football player run for 12 straight minutes during a game or run 2 miles. And when you break down the physiology of it, you could not make a logical argument for doing a 2-mile run for an offensive lineman. It just doesn't make much sense. Now, if you're doing it for other reasons, right? If you're doing it maybe for, I don't know, to try to control body weight or body composition, you could maybe get close to making a logical argument. But then I think there's research that's come in the last 20 or 30 years that would say, well, that's not how you do it. You know, you need to do it with the types of activities they're involved in during a game. So it's strength training and anaerobic work and quickness and sprint drills and things of that nature. And then you also don't do it for punishment, right? You don't make an offensive lineman go out and run a mile for punishment. That just doesn't make any sense. You know, that I think really sort of shows the connection between exercise physiology and sports psychology, and behavior management. And so those conversations were really very rich and very meaningful to me and especially now when I look back on it. You know, at the time, I may not have fully appreciated the depth of the conversation or the significance that it would have. But now I look back and say, you know, that was really enjoyable. And that's probably some of the, I think, most satisfying interactions that I have with my master's and doctoral students, is to just sit around and talk about that. And we also talked a little bit about how bad the Braves were. And that's how I know I started on this conversation. And I have a funny story to tell you. We went to a game one time in Atlanta's Fulton County Stadium. And I remember the announced paid attendance was 1,212. And you could sit anywhere you wanted to. And, you know, the Braves must have listened to Dennis and I, because they started to get better after the 90s. They started, or the 1990, they started to get really good and became a very, very good baseball team. So
it's those conversations that you have with your students, your doctoral students, your master's students, are, as you said, enriching for everyone involved. Absolutely. So you were telling me also about a mentor that you had earlier named Sam Case. Yeah, tell us a little bit about Sam Case.
Yeah, Sam Case was at Western Maryland College, which has changed its name to McDaniel College, probably about 15 or 20 years ago. But Sam was a faculty member at Western Maryland, and Western Maryland College is a very small private liberal arts college on the border of Maryland, Pennsylvania state line. And Sam was a student of David Lamb, who was at Ohio State University. And so Sam studied under David and I studied under Sam. So I guess based on your sort of comments earlier, I'm related to a lot of people from Ohio State University and the students of Dr. Lamb. But I really enjoyed my time working with Sam, and he had a really good approach as a mentor. I was working full time as a public school teacher at the time, and I could only take classes either in the evenings or in the summertime. So in the evenings, I would come from baseball practice, you know, coaching baseball, or football practice, coaching football, and drive about an hour to class down at Western Maryland. And Sam was there, and he was always excited. And, you know, we would talk a lot of physiology. We'd talk about the general principles. We had a variety of labs. And I knew from taking his courses and being involved with him that, you know, being a college professor was what I really wanted to do, and work with students. He helped me with my master's thesis, which was the effects of a 12-week strength and conditioning program on resting blood pressure. It was a lot of fun to work on that project. He was, again, a very good mentor. But Sam, interestingly enough, had a very unique line of research. Sam got involved in the Iditarod race in Alaska. And for about, I'm going to say maybe 10 or 12 years in a row, Sam would go to Alaska and he would study the participants in the Iditarod race. And then he also did, so the Iditarod race was a dog sled race, for those of you listening that aren't familiar. But then he also did a physical competition. It wasn't as long, but it was kind of like snowshoeing through Alaska in the middle of winter. And he would tell us what he would have to take for provisions, because if you think about, outside in the cold, you're going to increase thermal activity. You're going to generate more heat so you can stay warm. You're carrying a lot of equipment. You're on snowshoes, which makes it hard. They would pack pizza, and they would pack chocolate chip cookies. And that's what they would take when they would go on this, and it was called the Iditasport, where they would just go from community to community, because you needed something that had a really high calorie density. And every year he would go, he would say, Jeff, do you want to come along? I got money, you can come to Alaska. And I kept saying, no way I'm going up there in the middle of winter. But he would ask me every time, and I was always humbled by the fact that he would ask me, but I was fascinated by the food that he would take. And so when I started my research career, I became more interested in caloric intake and how individuals burn carbohydrates and fats. And so it was really fascinating to sort of listen to his stories. And again, he helped sort of mentor me to be a researcher and a scholar.
It's interesting. You bring up several interesting points there, but one is the Iditarod. And listeners of the podcast know we've had a professor from vet med at Oklahoma State, a guy named Mike Davis, who actually studies the dogs and goes up every year. It's very similar to what you were talking about. He goes up every year and does that work up there with the sled dogs and how they're amazing athletes. And I think they feed the dogs Crisco, balls of Crisco at the end of the day, because it's calorically dense and they burn through so much energy. So much like what Sam was telling you back then. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating work. And you had mentioned earlier the Introduction to Exercise Science textbook. And I do want to mention, Tim, it's actually on its 4th edition, which is really exciting, because
okay.
when I first wrote it, I thought, sure, the first edition is a one and done. I mean, I didn't think that it would be so popular. But one of the things that I do want to point out is that in each chapter, and you had mentioned this, I try to bring a little history to the topic. So I try to really bring some of the names forward, right, that have been important in the field of exercise physiology, because I think it's important for us to remember those who've come before us, the foundation that they've laid, the work that they've done. It may seem odd, but I like reading old journal articles. I can remember there was a time when I was teaching at the University of Kansas. And this was back in the day when you actually had to go to the library to get journal articles, right? You had to walk across campus and you'd pick out the volumes and you would go to the copy machine and you'd spend either 5 or 10 cents a photocopy, and you'd make these copies of your articles and you'd take them back to your office and then you'd read them. Not like today, where I can sit in my office right now and I can get any article that I want from basically any journal in physiology around the world. But I remember going to the library at the University of Kansas, and I would go down into the sections where the Journal of Applied Physiology was located, or where Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise was located. And I would pull out old issues just to kind of see what was going on back in 1920, 1930, 1940, and sort of read. And that's where I became interested in this. And you talk about, history, right? The Harvard Fatigue Lab has been prominent in the development of exercise physiology. And even though it's been closed for 60 or 70 years, the legacy of the Harvard Fatigue Lab lives on with D.B. Dill and a number of other individuals that just spread across the country with the closure of the lab and opened up their own laboratories of exercise physiology. it's fascinating to really look at who we're related to and what has come before us.
Well, and it's very interesting. The listeners here will have heard some common names. We had recently on the podcast Dr. Sue Bloomfield, and David Lamb was a big influence in her life, and he was influenced indirectly in your life. And we've talked about Ed Halley today, who will be a future guest on this podcast. And so it is. It's been a small community, but certainly it has expanded over the last 20 years, especially with the explosion of exercise physiology in the country. And you and I have both been witness to that. So it's interesting to see all the connections and how everyone has, you said, has spread out over the country to have those connections.
Yeah, and it just happened sort of serendipitously. I was in my final year at grad school at Auburn University, and Dennis Wilson just hired Bruce Gladden. And Bruce came there as a faculty member, and I think he had previously been for a couple years at the University of Louisville, but he had worked at the University of Florida. And he brought in all those different connections came together, and I got to work sort of indirectly with Bruce for a year. I was kind of in his lab. I wasn't a GA or an RA. I would just go in and kind of watch them do experiments because they were doing lactate transport. And Bruce had just a phenomenal lab, phenomenal work ethic, and I never realized that I would come to know Bruce for 35 years as a colleague, and to be able to read the papers that he's written, the review papers, the original research, working with folks again all across the country, listening to him talk about George Brooks' ideas, right, and what George's thoughts are on lactate metabolism. And of course, George Brooks was a faculty colleague, and I think maybe of Tim White, and maybe Tim might even have been his student. But for a long time, the book of Brooks, Fahey, and White in exercise physiology was the book that you used for any graduate coursework whatsoever. So again, you have these connections that you sort of meet these people, and it was just a great opportunity to get to know Bruce, to work with Bruce, and of course, being in the Southeast Conference chapter, or this, I guess I should say, the Southeast chapter of ACSM. I was in the Southeast Conference for Auburn, and that's a whole different conversation. But to go to those meetings and see the individuals who were the legends of exercise physiology was really just fascinating, and still is.
And I promise the listeners that we're going to have George Brooks on this podcast as well. So, keep an ear on it. And we'd be remiss if we didn't tell the folks that if they don't know, Bruce Gladden is the current president of the American College of Sports Medicine as well. So he has cut a big swath across exercise physiology as well. So Jeff, I really want to thank you so much for your time today. And as you remember, we always give our guests an opportunity to give us a take-home message. What would be a take-home message for you today as you think about the historical foundations of exercise physiology?
Tim, I think the take-home message would be to pay attention to the history and really dig into it to understand the foundation, how that foundation was built for the work that we do today. The example I gave earlier of talking about how you train baseball players or how you train football players, 50 or 60 years ago, that's how you did it. I mean, it was a completely different type of training method. And so I think we need to remember what has happened in the past. We need to be aware of how that activity in the past can inform us for what we're going to do in the future. And I think it really lays a solid foundation for practical aspects. I think it lays a solid foundation for, anything that we do clinically and anything that we do for our athletes and trying to improve their performance. So looking back on history is not, I hope, not something that's kind of boring and in the past. I hope it can be used as something to inform what we do in the present and how we move forward in the future.
An absolutely great take-home message, because those people that moved this field forward in the past, they were people. And
They were.
same
They were,
foibles,
yep.
and they had interesting stories about them, but so many of us were impacted by those people, and have meant so much to our lives. So Jeff, thank you again for this reminder today about how important that is. And I
Thank
want
you,
to
Tim.
thank
I was going to say thank you, Tim, for inviting to be on the show. I had a wonderful time, and it's been a very, very good experience.
Fabulous. Well, again, thank you for being with us. So we want to thank you all for joining us this week, and we hope that you stay active and healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next episode.